Today I'm speaking with Reeves Wiedeman. Reeves is the author of Billion Dollar Loser. It is a mind-blowing story covering the epic rise and fall of Adam Neumann and his once successful startup called WeWork. In one moment, the company's valuation was $47 billion, and they were gearing up for a major IPO. The next, Adam is pushed out of his own company, the valuation tanks, and the IPO gets canceled. This story has it all. $1 billion in funding, a villain-like character, founding it all, and is probably most importantly a cautionary tale of the mania surrounding some Silicon Valley startups. Leave a comment below with your biggest takeaway. Finally, to thank you for checking out the new show, I'm giving away a PlayStation 5. All you have to do is like and subscribe to enter. Details in the comments. Now please welcome Reeves Wiedeman to the Welcome Home podcast. It seems like the average person is drawn to this story for two main reasons. One is the valuation and the sheer numbers associated with the words WeWork, and the other is this villain character, Adam Neumann. Those are two really interesting parts to this story, but I was curious if there's an underlying theme in your book and what also captivates people, and it's the cautionary tale of Silicon Valley. Unicorn startups, 10 billion plus hyper funded. So is it accurate to think beyond the WeWork valuation, beyond Adam Neumann, this character, there is also a warning that you're almost writing about of, hey, we should maybe take a second look at what's going on in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I think beyond, as thinking about this as a project I wanted to take on, there were a lot of fun, crazy stories to write about. Adam was a fun and crazy guy, and that came through in a lot of ways. But beyond that, I think what you're talking about is sort of the exact point that I wanted to make, and that I think WeWork does sort of stand in for a lot of different things that were happening in the business world. All over the place, but mostly in Silicon Valley over the past decade, which is these companies whose ambitions were in many cases much bigger than the realities of what they did and what they were good at. And WeWork was in certain ways just perhaps the taking that argument to the extreme, both in kind of how the company grew and how quickly things kind of fell apart. But I think I did see it as a sort of cautionary tale for future entrepreneurs to sort of take a look at the story and recognize in Adam Neumann the things that worked, and then try to pick out some of the things that led to his and his company's demise.
To almost double down on that point, knowing we had this call today, and I was thinking about the story, in a parallel universe, if Adam made a couple different decisions and the IPO happens and the pandemic doesn't happen, there's a good chance that I'm having an interview with another author who's writing a very different book about the brilliance of Adam Neumann. So do you see that very fine line? And I don't want to appear like I'm defending Adam Neumann, but there is something almost insane about startup culture where you are either a villain who is humiliated or there are books written about your brilliance. Do you see that?
It's an extremely thin line. And you're right. There were specific instances you can look back with hindsight and say, if only Adam had made a different decision here, things might have gone differently. But at the time, who was to argue? The company was growing quickly. This was all the things he was doing was in many ways the sort of prevailing kind of thing you would push for. I think the thing I think about a lot is is it necessarily a good goal to want books to be written about you, good or bad? Should there have been a book written about WeWork? Is there a version of this company and of many companies that would provide something really good for the world? That there was a level at which what WeWork offered to entrepreneurs, to anyone, was a better day at work. That was very simple. That was a thing that everyone could get behind, and that frankly the existing sort of commercial real estate world wasn't offering. So I think in some ways the sad part to me is that I think there is an ethos among founders, in particular, of wanting to be the kind of person who has books written about you. Elon Musk, who remains perpetually in the news, feels very questionable what tack the books written about him, as there will inevitably be, will say. And on the one hand, we do sort of want these visionaries, these people who are there kind of driving us to bigger and better things. But I think in a lot of ways, the pursuit of that, the pursuit of becoming a sort of world dominating company, whether you're successful or not, comes with lots of consequences. And often people don't think about that on the way up.
When things were going well for WeWork, how much of their valuation, how much of their growth was the business model, the supply and demand, and what percentage was Adam's brilliance as a salesman to hype this startup?
Sure. Well, if you looked at the money they were bringing in, this was a four, five, $6 billion company. Maybe if you give it a little bit of that sort of startup pixie dust of thing is growing fast, it's going to get big. Maybe you could double that. Um, so that gets you to 10 or 12 million. This company was valued at 47 billion, excuse me, 10 or 12 billion, and it was eventually valued at 47 billion. So I don't think it's quite right that it was totally based on Adam's sort of being out there expressing his vision and pushing this narrative. I think that was a big thing. But the bigger thing is that people bought into it, that people wanted it to be true. It wasn't just that these investors heard Adam say this and just completely bought hook, line, and sinker a narrative that wasn't true. They wanted it to be true. They wanted to believe that Adam and this company were capable of doing something that traditional business metrics would say wasn't going to work. And so, I think when you think about the valuation, I think Adam gets blamed for it, but if anyone is truly to blame, it's the sort of investors who actually put in the money and bought into this. These were not stupid people who suddenly bought into something, and not that they're necessarily stupid, but this is not a GameStop situation. This is not something where people are kind of buying in for fun or just because everyone else is doing it. These were very smart, very sophisticated people who were pushing this number higher and higher and higher on their own.
Is it correct that you've actually met Adam?
I have. We met in April of 2019. We had an interview in his office at WeWork headquarters. At the time, the company had not even said that it was going public yet. That would come actually just a few weeks later, and I didn't know at the time, but they were in the sort of heat of planning that. And we had a half-hour interview, and as has been reported by many other people, he is just as charming and confident and intelligent and smart as everyone says, and that much could come clear in just a short meeting, that he was definitely the kind of person who, no matter who's in the room with him, he instantly believes he is the alpha and takes control of the conversation.
Going further on that, if you had to, what is the best and worst trait of Adam Neumann?
Uh, Good question. Um, in terms of his best traits, I'll go with two of them, and they'll be related. One is, people will say that he was extremely smart. He was someone who could sit down and think through numbers, and he knew the real estate business. He knew the business that he was in extremely well. And so there was this level at which he was not just someone out there saying these lofty kind of crazy things. He was actually someone who did intrinsically sort of know his business well. Relatedly, that then allowed him to sort of be extremely ambitious and to say, I am going to break all of these rules. I understand the rules. I understand how things work, but I'm going to be do something differently. And this is, the path that every genius or mad genius who gets a book written about them has this kind of trait of thinking that I can come in and through some sort of force of will make something out of nothing, make something that wasn't possible before. I think there's a flip side of that, which is his I think greatest flaw or blind spot was the hubris of that, the hubris of going from I understand the commercial real estate business. I know how it works. I'm going to do something crazy, and you know what? It's kind of working. The office space business is that WeWork was operating was bringing in a lot of money. It was something that people wanted. It was clearly something where the business model needed to be worked out, but they were selling something people wanted, and they were doing it differently, and it was working. Suddenly, that put in Adam's head this idea that we can do all these other things. We can get into the world of apartments. We can get into opening an elementary school, investing in a wave pool company, kind of all these things that were of course in hindsight crazy, but to him made perfect sense that we were so successful at this, we're of course going to be successful at that.
Is it strange that there are so many points that stuck with this story, but there's one point that, for whatever reason, I wrote down a note on it. It sounds like, in simple terms, WeWork was a real estate company. It was leasing office space, and that's cool. But he would only refer to WeWork as a tech company. In so many cases, he believed that this was tech, that there was R&D. Is that a bizarre part to this story, or was there some strategy in saying, hey, we're a tech company to attract Silicon Valley investors?
Yeah, he talked about the company in a lot of different ways. He described it as a tech company. He described it as a community company. He would go to great pains to say that this was not a real estate company, and there were a couple of reasons for that. There was the fact that to get investment from the tech world, and really from anyone over the past decade, you needed to convince people that you were somehow changing the economics of a particular business, and the easiest way to do that was to bring technology to it, to disrupt a nascent industry that had been operated the same way for decades as real estate was, to come in and say we're doing something differently because we're bringing tech to it. He also talked about it as a community company, that the thing WeWork was selling was not office space, but the feeling that you get in the office, the feeling of working alongside people, the connections you have by knowing there are people in WeWorks all over the world. And this was a compelling, if kind of theoretical argument. And I think the reason for presenting the company this way was, on the one hand, I think that Adam believed it. I think that he believed that they were, certainly on the community aspect, that they were bringing something new and different to these kinds of spaces and the way that people felt about them, and sort of lived within them. But it also, the real estate business is what it is. People know how much it costs to operate a building, and they know how much money you can make. And there are only so many ways to sort of change those numbers in a meaningful and dramatic way. And Adam wanted to do that. And certainly the people who enabled him wanted him to do that as well.
Another strange part that stuck to me was the mission statement. Did he ever explain that grandiose mission statement for WeWork to you or any other writers, or was it just this vague statement of grandiosity?
When I asked him when I sat down and interviewed him, and I think the mission statement you're talking about was the one that they came up with in 2019, which was to elevate the world's consciousness. And I told him that when I had mentioned it to people, they asked me what it meant, and I didn't have a good answer, and I told him that it was clearly confusing to people, and his answer was, that's a good thing. That's a good thing that people are thinking and asking questions about this. That's exactly what we're doing and what we want to be doing. And I think on the one hand, I see what he's saying. On the other hand, you're sort of punting on it, and at the end of the day, a mission statement is the reason it's there is to give clarity to what you're doing. And I think for the first half decade plus of this company, there was a very clear mission statement. It was make a life, not a living. It was building a better day at work. It was these things that were very clear both to the employees about what they were doing and what they were providing to people, and to customers about what they were getting. And so it all sort of made sense. And so even when you were talking in these high and mighty ways, it all came back to this mission that made sense. So I think when you got to this other thing where people get confused, it makes it hard to do your job. When you're an employee at this place, you aren't totally sure what that means. You aren't totally sure how your role fits into that. And I think that ultimately was a big problem.
Earlier, we talked about how fast narratives can change. You could be a genius or a villain. I'm curious, at the peak of WeWork, pre-IPO, what was the narratives? Your fellow writers, journalists, what were they saying about Adam Neumann? What were they saying about this company before things start to take that turn?
They were saying all the things Adam was saying. They were asking questions. I mean, they were saying this is a company making a new way of doing things, a new way of having an office, a new way of managing a real estate company. And they were saying maybe he's right, maybe it's working. Clearly some smart people are saying this along the way. So I think there were questions about the business model, but this was not a time for asking questions. This, especially in the business world, for much of the 2010s, it was a time of promoting these companies, frankly. I think it's a little bit strong to say that journalists and the media sort of carried water for some of these companies, but there was a general ethos for a while, and this has only really turned recently, I think, where it was these companies were seen as forces for good, and disruption was good, and you shouldn't ask too many questions about it.
Can you walk me through the IPO? Because in my head, the day those papers get released is kind of the end of this whole ride to the top. Can you explain why they want to go public and what exactly happened once they opened up their books?
Yeah, well, the reason any company wants to go public is because they need money. I mean, often we think about IPOs as oh, these are just times for investors to get in, and employees to cash out, and things like that. But the practical reality of an IPO is that a company goes public because they need money, and WeWork was continuing to grow. That growth was costing a lot, and they didn't have any more places in the private markets to go for money. So they were out of options, and it was not necessarily something that Adam was eager to do, because going public comes with all kinds of restrictions and restraints, and but it was something they had to do, or they were going to run out of money. And what happened there is a lot of things, but when the company finally published its S1, which is the document that is filed with the SEC in advance of an IPO, um, it for the first time sort of opened up the books to the public. And I think for years, even people who were skeptical of the company had this idea in the back of their head, or this fear that maybe Adam has figured something out. Maybe they have kind of changed the how the economics of a real estate business works in such a way that his business will be different than mine, and he can make money in bigger and better ways than I can. And the books sort of revealed that wasn't the case. It revealed that yes, this is a good business, but it's not a $47 billion business. And on top of that, the paperwork was also filled with things that a lot of people saw as sort of confusing distractions. There were these pretty photos, and there was kind of some of that kind of gobbledygooky language that was so endemic to the company, and the public was seeing a lot of this for the first time. A lot of people knew who WeWork was, but the vast majority of people had never heard of it, and suddenly this company is all over the news, burning lots of money, saying crazy things with a crazy seeming guy at the top. And it was just sort of a perfect recipe for bringing the company down.
So once those books get revealed, that scares off investors or interest plummets, or is there a big media article kind of exposing these? What makes them halt that public offering?
I mean, ultimately, it's that investors aren't willing to invest in the company. I mean, in the weeks after that, Adam Neumann and other WeWork executives were traveling around talking to the biggest investors in the world, and it's one thing for me or you or whoever on Robinhood to say I'm going to throw in a couple $100, a couple $1,000 into an IPO. He was going to places like Fidelity that could on its own invest $1 billion on behalf of all of its clients, and those people were saying, hold on a second, we're not so sure that you're worth what you say you are, and we're not so sure we're willing to invest at this level. And I do think there were obviously the media coverage did not help. It did not give the company any room to sort of negotiate and pivot, and it was just kind of relentless and a sort of downward spiral in that way. But ultimately it came down to the big investors that you need to make an IPO work were not willing to invest.
Beyond his personality flaws, there were a couple really glaring things in the books that none of his advisors told him, hey, this might not look great. What shocked me most was he was leasing or licensing the company's name to the company for almost $6 million. He owned some properties that he was leasing to the company. He took out or he sold a bunch of his stock pre-IPO. Can you explain the big ones that were red flags? And I mean, the follow-up question would have to be, is there no one around him saying, hey, Adam, people are going to start asking questions of where a lean startup that's hemorrhaging money, we probably shouldn't license the name to yourself. So I guess that's part two of the question, but can you explain the early red flags?
Yeah, I mean, look, every startup in its early days is run like a family operation, whether or not you hire your cousins or your best friends or whoever it is. And WeWork was certainly that way. And real estate is a world filled with shady backroom, underhanded deals. And WeWork was no different. No matter how they were talking about the company in public, the people in charge were getting cuts on the side, and it's debatable in some cases in what effect that had on the company. But what is without question is that at a certain point, when you become a certain size, when you're playing with other people's money and not just your own, that becomes a problem. And so yes, when Adam and others owned buildings that they were then leasing to WeWork, who determines what those lease payments are? Who determines that WeWork isn't just going to pay an exorbitant rate for Adam in one of his buildings? With something like the owning the We trademark, that was one where, honestly, it looked worse than it was. Frankly, it was, at least by all accounts, it was sort of an accounting decision that had to be made and was made poorly, and but it gave off the exact wrong impression, and not what you wanted to give. And so I think they were just slow, painfully slow to sort of realize just how damaging those perceptions would be.
It's interesting how Adam seemed to be so talented and charismatic in a private room with investors to get him excited about a company or in the media. And he had this talent and this skill of getting people excited. He understood public relations in that way, but there were these glaring blind spots. Like I do understand maybe the WeWork name being licensed is overblown, but for someone that talented, you think he wouldn't have a blind spot to foresee at least what it would look like on the front page of a business section, right?
Yeah, I think, it wasn't like something that wasn't talked about, but frankly, other very smart people, very sober people, didn't think it was going to be that big of a deal. I think everyone looking at it kind of wished it wasn't there, but they also thought, you know. this is not going to kill us. This is an issue. We're going to get credit for being open about these things, and it's going to be fine. And that was a belief shared by a lot of people. And I think, yeah, I think it's hard to remember, or to that hard to remember that this company had a decade of almost unimpeded success, and so you're told constantly you can't do this, you can't do that, and then you do it and it works out fine. Eventually, you do sort of start to assume that things are always gonna work out okay. And so I think it wasn't just a blind spot for Adam. I think it was a blind spot for anyone who had sort of been on the rocket ship on the way up.
So WeWork's biggest investor, Softbank, they were aware of this. Is it accurate to say they were aware and they just overlooked it because of the success? Or do you think the private investors weren't aware of some of the side businesses and the side spending?
Yeah, they were aware. I mean, they knew that Adam was a profligate, lived a fancy life. I think occasionally he got some mild talkings too. His ownership of buildings was something that was eventually approved by the board, in certain cases. And so, that's where I say I think that it wasn't just Adam who had this kind of blind spot, that it was something shared by everyone around him.
So walk me through when Adam gets pushed out. Was that expected from the outside looking in? Was it a surprising announcement? How does he get told that it's best for him to leave?
It was certainly a shocking downfall, in the span of just a couple of weeks, from him being one of the biggest founders, CEOs, of any company, and certainly as one who had control of his entire company. He was seen as this sort of dominant figure, by pretty much everyone, and so for him to be removed at that moment was sort of unheard of. And I think, as the weeks wore on between the release of the S1 and ultimately Adam stepping down, it became harder and harder to figure out what the move would be, how the company could get out of this, simply because, rightly, and in some cases a little unfairly, but generally rightly, all of the issues were tied back to Adam, and it felt like if the company wanted to move forward, he needed to not be there, anymore. And so ultimately it was board members who did not want to do this, but frankly, board members who liked Adam, who were grateful to him for having pushed the company to great heights, who made a lot of money, along the way, coming to this difficult decision, and ultimately banding together, and pushing him out. I mean, it was a fairly dramatic few days where I think people were holding on hope that this IPO would still happen, that they would get through this. It was just bad PR, but ultimately it just got to a point where people couldn't stand it anymore.
People might be listening and saying, "Wow, this guy got pushed out. It must have been dramatic. He must have been kicking and screaming." But there's also an element of like a buyout package. Can you
Sure.
explain that? And if you thought it was fair or a little bit, I don't know, exaggerated how much money
Mhm.
he was promised to leave.
Yeah. Well, Adam didn't want to leave. I mean, that's for sure. And he did control this company. I mean, from a literal sort of legal perspective, in addition to all the ways that he was just sort of the dominant figure. And so, for the investors who wanted him to be gone, to not just no longer be CEO, but to no longer be a shareholder, to no longer be a member of the board, there was only one option, and that was to buy him out, and to buy out his shares. And I think there has been, this is again perhaps one of those situations of people choosing to not accept how the optics of something look, and how paying someone a $185 million consulting fee after he seemingly drove things into the ground might look to the employees who are no longer going to get the payout from their IPO. I think certainly it was bad form. There are certain arguments that Adam deserved it, if you look at the numbers just as they are, but he also hasn't gotten it. This is something that's been tied up in legal drama for the past year, and seems likely to continue a little bit longer. We still don't know exactly how much of this sort of $1 billion exit package Adam's going to ultimately receive.
So I've heard a lot of people say that WeWork was a good business, it wasn't a great business, and it wasn't a unicorn business like it ended up becoming. But just saying it was a good business, I feel like this story is a cautionary tale for other startups, almost in what not to do in terms of public relations. I mean, if you could say it's a good business, that's pretty interesting. But the disasters seem to be blind spots of not realizing how the public would feel, how employees would feel about certain things. Is it almost safe to say, beyond the business not being as great as it was hyped up to be, that this was PR mistake after PR mistake after mistake in that way?
I actually think it's the opposite. I think that the PR apparatus was doing what it could with the core goals of the company. I mean, this was
Wow.
not Adam. Adam was not saying these things to get PR. He was saying them because he believed them, and that was ultimately the problem. He thought we are going to change education, we are going to change residential living, and then it was the PR teams. The CEO is telling you that, and then it's the PR teams has to figure out how to spin that. And for a long time it worked actually. And so I think there are certain ways in where, yes, like the PR team could have pushed back more forcefully, but ultimately they serve at the pleasure of the CEO, and they're there to give advice, and in many cases they did give advice, and in certain ways it was ignored. And I think I see your point about it being PR issues, but I think ultimately the problem was that the core beliefs of the people leading the company were what were leading it astray.
Do you believe, beyond the story, that WeWork was in fact a good company? And part two of that, do you believe if there isn't a global pandemic that it's growing step by step?
Um, I think WeWork is a good idea. I think that the company was certainly a great place to work for a lot of people for a long time, and it was offering something that people wanted. And everything else, we live, we grow, I think were mistakes, and I think mistakes were made along the way. But the core idea makes sense. People want more flexible lease terms. They want better designed offices, more comfortable and interesting offices. That's just more or less a given. And whether or not the company is worth what it was worth, I think is a different question than what it provided was valuable. The pandemic has obviously changed everything for everyone, and maybe few companies as much as it has for WeWork. They're in a tough spot. People don't want to be in offices right now. In many places, they are not allowed to be in offices. It's not clear when that's going to change. It's not totally clear how that's going to change, and how people's perception of what their offices are for should be. Um, they're pitching themselves as we are the place to have a different kind of office. You don't need the old big office that you had. You need flexible space, which is what we're specialists in. That's a good idea, but in practice, I think it's going to be a lot more difficult to turn that from being an idea into a business that actually works.
Something that I found interesting, how I initially found your book and this story, someone on my team had recommended it, and it was the same person that recommended I read Bad Blood, that
Okay.
book as well. And what I thought was really interesting, Bad Blood was one of my favorite audiobooks last year. The contrast here, and what we have to, I guess, make clear for people that haven't read the book yet, there was no gross fraud in this story. A
Hmm.
lot of people see the how villainized Adam's been, and from 47 billion to I don't know if it's going to be around in 2 more years. But what they, I think, should be clear, and what makes it almost even more incredible how it's fallen, is there was no gross fraud exposed.
Yeah, I mean, lots of people want to make that comparison to Theranos. I think there are certain things that ring true in both stories, but as far as we know, this was not a situation. The offices were there; they worked in a way that the Theranos device never did, and so in certain ways that makes this a different story. It wasn't as sort of black and white and cut and dry. It this is a just sort of a broader tale of what can go wrong for a company when it pushes a little too high and too hard.
While you were reporting this, were there any people that came out on the fringes that did have bold claims that there were lies, there were cooking the books, there were elements of fraud in this, or that's not at all a part of this story?
Uh, if I found it, it would have been in the book.
Okay.
So there's lots of questions, suggestions, but nothing concrete. And it's possible things may emerge, but by and large, I think this is a different kind of story.
So I found your book because of the Theranos book. And then there's another thread in here that you might laugh at, but Billy McFarland from
Sure.
Firefest somehow gets involved in this story
Yeah.
in a small way. Can you explain that?
Billy was a tenant. Billy was a WeWork tenant early on in New York City, even before he had started Fire, his company that became Fire Festival. So on the one hand, he was just around the early days of WeWork, and I talked to him when he's in prison and spoke to him about sort of what he took from it, and I think he took some lessons from what Adam was talking about community, and said he kind of applied that to some of his businesses. So, I think there's all kinds of ways when you look at these two. I think they're different in certain ways, but certainly in their ambition and the way they get people to follow them. I think they ended up having kind of a lot in common.
I read an article that claimed Adam yelled at a manager because they purchased a coffee maker without his approval. And
Hmm.
I mean, as a founder that's creating a frugal startup, a lean startup, that makes a lot of
Sure.
sense. But the numbers, the sheer billions that were invested, I guess I could picture a startup that has $4 million in funding and how tough that is to pay employees, pay for ads, for growth. But once we start talking about billions, where was this money spent? It's almost seems difficult to spend what they had.
Have you ever tried to renovate an entire office building and operate it with people every day? That's the difference. I mean, software companies, it's you need people, you need server space, you need an office, and that's it. I mean, this is construction, this is operating costs, it's a lot of money to sort of operate one of these spaces. So whether you buy the $20,000 espresso maker that someone got in trouble for, or you hire the barista to serve it, that's going to cost you a lot of money. And so, just this is, and that's one reason WeWork attracted so much money, is that this is actually a business where the costs are extremely high, and for WeWork, it was in many ways just a problem of getting that cost lower, which was a trick they never fully realized.
So to be fair to Adam, was he in some ways like a frugal attempt to be a lean founder?
He had moments. I mean, I think it's not totally right to say that this was just a free spending startup. I mean, there were moments in the company's history where they tried to clamp down. There were certain things in which the company would be cheap, but at the same time, it's hard if you're an employee to take seriously those ideas when you see your founder buying a private jet and the way that he lives and the way the company spends money on certain things. It's hard to compute in your brain that you need to be just pinching pennies on your job while other people don't seem to have to. So I think it was a hard message to send, even if he tried to do it, just given the way that he and others acted at various points.
Did WeWork ever have a profitable quarter, or did they ever show glimmers of hope of being a profitable company?
They were profitable very early on, before a lot of the money poured in, and before they started growing. Certainly, they would make some arguments that it was kind of leveling out, but by the end, as they were approaching the IPO, the costs were growing just as quickly, if not more quickly, than the money they were bringing in. So, there was always an argument they would make that we can turn off the growth whenever we want, and then once we do that, our costs stop growing, while our revenue keeps increasing. Unfortunately, they never got to quite see if that would bear out, and I think there's a lot of questions as to whether that would have actually worked out. But the answer, at least so far, is no. And if the pandemic has offered one thing, it forced them to cut back drastically on costs. They laid off more than half their workforce.
Wow.
They've cut a number of the offices that they have and gotten rid of them. So they've been forced into cost cutting mode, and we'll see if they can do that in enough of a way to make a difference.
When you started writing the book up until today, did you become colder or warmer to who Adam Neumann was as a person? Did you like him more at the end of the book, or did you grow in disgust as you wrote?
I think that I grew to like parts of him. And I think maybe the way I would answer this question is that, in certain ways, as a person, I came to respect Adam. I came to understand why he made certain decisions. I came to understand some of the anxieties that he felt as a founder, and as a leader, and that some of the reasons he was acting certain ways was based on just his life and who he was and where he came from. And so, I think I had sympathy and empathy for that. I think looking at the way that he grew his company, I think I would have even more critiques, I think, than I did. But I think one thing that emerged, and that I hope emerges from the book, is that Adam's a full person. He's not a caricature. He's not the caricature that has kind of existed in the media. And so, in certain ways, I think he deserves more criticism, and in others, I think people need to remember that if it was you in the same situation, you may not have acted all that differently.
Yeah, I'm really glad you put it that way, because when I first heard the headlines in this story and I dove into just the intro, I'm thinking this guy must have been like Elizabeth Holmes. He must have been ruthless. He must have been lying. There must have been fraud. And towards the end of the story, and as I'm talking to you, wrapping things up, I've started to say it starts to feel like there's almost a bigger problem with the model of Silicon Valley, that I'm sure there's startups right now that are having meetings saying our founder isn't charismatic enough, our founder isn't selling this as well as we should, versus the raw numbers on paper. Is it fair to say, of course, Adam made outrageous errors and failed countless times, but the business that is Silicon Valley startups, the business of getting funded, seems like the thing that should be criticized most at the end of the story?
Yeah, it's always the system that's worse than the people, and I think that, if the problem is the system's always also harder to change. You can get rid of Adam Neumann from his company, but the problems still exist, the broader issues, and I'm less hopeful that anything like that has changed. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We are, at some point emerging into a new world, and I have a fear that the same problems are going to exist in new companies. And I think that all we can hope is that, short of a change in the system of the way we structure our economy and our society, that founders themselves need to just sort of look internally about their motivations and why they're doing something. And if you're doing something just to grow, that may not be the best thing for the world. It may not be the best thing for your company, and it may not be the best thing for you. And that's a difficult sort of realization to come to, but I think it's an important one.
To celebrate the new podcast, I'm giving away a PlayStation 5 to one of my viewers. All you have to do is like and subscribe. That's it. Full details in the comments. Good luck.